The goal of this lesson is to pull in the mapping objects we just defined and emit the button or axis names with each of the pressed, released, and move events instead of the ID currently being passed along. To accomplish this, I'm going to rely on a utility library called Lodash to help search through the mapping objects to retrieve the button and axis names. If you're not familiar with Lodash, you can check out the link I've provided in this lesson to the library's website at lodash.com to see what functionality it has to offer. To install the library, I just need to switch to the console and run npm install Lodash. Now I just need to require it in my controller module, so I will pull it in at the top with the rest of the packages and assign it to an underscore variable, which is a common convention used when working with this library. The next step is to pull in the configuration file I defined in the last lesson so that the controller module has access to all of the mapping objects. This is done in the same manner as pulling in another module by requiring the config file. You can just simply give the require function a path to the file. Since the config file lives in the same directory as my module file, I can just give the require statement a value of ./config.json and assign that result to a config variable. The // notation should already be familiar to you, as it's the same notation I used in the test file to pull in the controller module. But to recap, the / tells require to look in the current directory for the file name that follows. Once this statement executes, we'll have the full configuration object from that file sitting in the config variable that can be worked with just like any other JavaScript object. So now, what I want to do is utilize this object in each of the event handlers here to extract the name associated to the ID arguments. And this is where I will employ Lodash to help me out. Since I will essentially be performing the same type of lookup for each identifier, I will create a lookup function that can be called by each of the handlers. This function will need to know the button or axis ID, so I will add a parameter for that. And it will also need to know in which group of mapping objects to find the control ID, so I will add another parameter for the control group. The value passed in for this parameter will either be buttons or axes, which correspond to the properties I added in the config on the mappings object. For the actual lookup, I'm going to utilize the find function that Lodash offers. It takes in a collection, which will be an array in my case, as well as search criteria, which is called a predicate in the Lodash documentation, and returns the first object in that collection that matches the specified criteria. The goal here is to pass either the buttons or axes array into the find function and return the name property from the object that has a matching ID. I can actually accomplish this in a single line, so I will add a return statement, and then call the find function on Lodash. The first argument I need to pass in is the array in which I want to search. Since the configuration I pulled in at the top is an object with collection properties, I will use the dot notation to get the collection I want to search. Config is the main object, and currently it contains a single property called mappings, so I will start with that. The mappings property contains both of the arrays in which I'd like to search, buttons and axes. The control group parameter on my lookup function is what will dictate which array property to search, because again, it should only be passed a string value of buttons or axes which correspond to these two properties. Due to JavaScript's dynamic nature, I can use the bracket notation to access the appropriate array property by passing it the control group parameter. Now of course, if you want to take this a step further and ensure a valid value is passed in, you can certainly do that by adding a simple check on the control group parameter first to make sure the value is either buttons or axes. But I'm going to trust that I know what I'm doing here and leave that check out for sake of simplicity. The other argument I need to pass in to the find function is the predicate, which is an object literal containing the search criteria. This object literal must contain properties that exist on the objects in the collection in which you're searching. Otherwise, the find function won't know what you're trying to find. In my case, the objects in the arrays I'm searching only contain two properties, ID and name. Since the goal of the getControlName function is to look up objects based on the control's ID and return the corresponding name, I will add an ID property to the predicate object and assign to it the control ID passed into my new function here. To summarize what's going on here, I'm calling the Lodash find function and giving it either the buttons or axes array, which is determined by the value of the control group parameter passed in. Then, within that array, I'm looking for the object whose ID property matches the value of the control ID parameter. And to wrap this function up, I just need to return the name property from the object returned by the find function. If you want to code defensively, you may want to assign the result of the find function to a variable and then check for undefined, because if the find function can't find a matching object, that's what it returns. But again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just assume I'll get an object back from this function and return the name property directly off the call to find. And now I just need to wire up the new function by calling it from each of the event handlers. Starting with the AccessMove handler, I'll add the call just above the emit line and assign the result to a variable that I'll just call AccessName. I want to look up the name of the access ID passed into this handler, so I'll give the access ID to the lookup function, as well as a group name of axes, which corresponds to the axes array on the mappings object in the config. To wrap this handler up, I'll now emit the access name with the move event instead of the access ID. Okay, now I essentially just need to do the same thing with both of the button event handlers. Instead of access name though, I'll call this one button name. And instead of passing in access ID and axes as arguments, I'll pass in num, which is the parameter here on the event handler that corresponds to the ID of the button being released, and buttons, which corresponds to the buttons array property on the mappings object in the config. I think num isn't really clear as to what the parameter corresponds to though, so I will actually change that to button ID. And now I just need to wrap up by omitting the button name instead of the button ID. Alright, now I'll just quickly replicate this for the pressed event handler as well. Okay, that should be all we need to do in order to receive button and access names from the events on the controller module, so let's adjust the test file a bit to account for the new names. It doesn't even really need to be updated, but just so the parameter names actually identify the data being passed to them, I'll rename access ID to access name, and then I'll also change the button ID parameters to button name. Now let's fire this test application up here and see what we get. Well, with the bogus events triggered by Gamepad, it looks like we're off to a pretty good start. You can see that each of the access names were mapped properly, but just for good measure, if I move the left joystick all around, I should see the appropriate access names being logged to the console. Nice. And the same should be true with the right joystick. Alright, and how about the left and right triggers? Solid. So far, so good. Alright, now how about those buttons? I'll just quickly hit each of them to ensure they were mapped properly as well. Now, of course, you'll just have to take my word for all of this, as you couldn't see me actually pressing the buttons, but you can verify that for yourself if you've been following along with the actual coding on your own machine. They went by pretty quickly and were mixed in with the left and right joystick move events, but you can even see the left and right stick pressed and released events that were fired when I pressed down on the joysticks. At this point, we should have a fully functional module that can be loaded into any application where an Xbox 360 controller might be used as an input device. However, the code is still a little too generic in the sense that we're not ensuring anywhere in the module's code that an actual Xbox 360 controller is being used by the end user. This is because the underlying gamepad module that I'm wrapping works with different types of controllers, such as PlayStation DualShock controllers, and they could actually be the ones triggering the events. In those cases, the mapping code that I just added may not work properly and will more than likely spew out errors, especially in the lookup function. If you don't plan on using anything except for Xbox 360 controllers with this module, then you shouldn't have anything to worry about and are free to inject this code into any JavaScript application you'd like. But if you're really interested in ensuring that only Xbox 360 controllers work with this module, then keep an eye out for Phase 2 of this mini-series where I will show you how to tackle these issues as well as a couple of others. Thanks for watching.